Trent Stellingwerff, welcome to the podcast.
Hey, thanks for having me on, Steve. It's a pleasure to be here.
Now, where are you at the moment? You're on training camp. You're away up in the hills, are you?
I am. I'm up in 2,100 meters, Flagstaff, Arizona. We have probably 20 or 25 distance runners here, so I'm working with Athletics Canada throughout the month of April up here in Flagstaff.
And how long are you away for? What's your altitude protocol?
We're here about 3.5 weeks. We found over the years that in terms of early season racing, the stability of weather in California is pretty good, and the races in May in California are of pretty good standard. So it's nice to set them up here in Flagstaff in April. And I think I've been here about a week, and I've probably seen 8 or 9 different countries represented here in Flagstaff. So it's a hot spot for April for sure.
Yeah, so I was talking to a few track and field runners from the UK. I think they were heading out early May, so you'll see some in the next few weeks.
There's a few up here already. I saw Lish up here, and and a few others. So actually just ran into Mark Rowlands on the track on Saturday. I know you know Mark, so it's small world.
It's a small inbred world.
Yes.
I loved working with Mark and Haley Tullett and Mike East, and we were just talking before we started there, weren't we? We were just about how blunt people can be, but he was just great. He would just cut to the chase, just no nonsense, tell it like it is, just giving it beans.
Yeah, I've enjoyed Mark's relationship over several years, and he's always great to sit down with, and he'll just lay things out, and I like laying things out, so he's always nice to catch up on. And we had an endurance conference up in Canada in November, so I pulled him up as one of the coach speakers. We had Andy Jones over as well, so a few Brits. And he was great because the crowd was probably 70% coaches and 30% sports scientists. And he's just a salt of the earth guy. And we did a great Q&A with him and Andy that was just gold.
I used to suggest to Mark that I would always make sure that I took my headache tablets, my ibuprofen or paracetamol when I'd go and work with him. We'd do the stuff by the track. It was fine. We would do the measurements and we'd get sort of feedback. And then he would get his folder out and he would show me this sort of really small handwriting training program ideas. And he would just throw sessions at me at such a rate of knots that I couldn't compute it. I would just get this headache every single time. It's just so passionate and intense and thoughtful and curious. It's really been bothering him, and he wanted to get it all off his chest.
Yeah, I know that sounds about right. At our conference, we went down for dinner, or I came down for dinner early, and there in the corner was Mark with one of our Canadian development running coaches, and he had a binder out, in fact, and they were pouring over this binder and, cross-pollinating ideas. And he's good that way. I think he actually just jumped on the plane today because there's Gemma Simpson's getting married to Chris this weekend. So he's heading over for that. So.
Oh, fantastic guys. And he kept me sane a number of times on training camp. So when I started coaching and people were sniping about this sports scientist doing this coaching and it was a difficult time actually of just thinking people are not just talking behind your back, they're talking about you to your face. And he would just say, just do your job, just focus on what you're here to do. And it kept me sane as a real friend and mentor there.
Yeah, that's great.
So look, it'd be really great to, I reckon we could probably record for hours here. Maybe we just do a series of chats because I've long respected what you've been up to, particularly the balance that you strike between that you're able to develop knowledge and science to a level of depth that would go toe to toe with that most academics would be admirable of. But equally, you've got that hands-on practice. So the dynamic there, I think, puts you in a very unique position, which I'm keen to explore. But would you just give us a little bit of an insight as to how you kind of started into this journey, this world of sports nutrition and sports science and supporting athletes?
Yeah, sure. Probably if there's one word that sets up my journey, it's variability. And I would really inspire any young practitioners coming through to look for variability in your career. And by variability, I mean I've lived and worked or went to school in 4 different countries. I think I was coached 20 years ago by 5 or 6 different running coaches. I've now probably worked with upwards of 40 different coaches across 3 or 4 different sports. I think I've worked in about 5 or 6 different labs and collaborated with about 15 different researchers. And so, my journey started in a small town in Canada, and I was a decent little high school runner. And I went to Cornell University to run track there. I was a miler. And at Cornell, I majored in nutrition and minored in exercise science. And I came out of Cornell and was able to land at the University of Guelph in Canada with Lawrence Spreet. Professor Spreet has a long history of great muscle metabolism work, but also applied research in caffeine and performance and hockey performance, and a nice breadth of mechanistic work, but also just good human applied research. And while I was at Guelph, I did my coaching degrees, and there's a coach there named Dave Scott Thomas, who is one of our best endurance coaches in Canada, and he mentored me as a coach, and I coached with the Guelph program. So Dave's group, for example, had I think 6 or 7 Olympians in Rio that came out of his group, and it was a good formative time. I was doing my PhD, I was doing coach education, and then Hilary and I got married and moved off to Luc van Loon's lab in Maastricht, Netherlands. So I worked there for a while, and then a job opened up to be the R&D lead for PowerBar, which at the time was owned by Nestle. And so Hilary and I moved from the Netherlands to Switzerland, where we were there for just over 5 years. That corporate experience was great in terms of leadership skills and professional development. At the time, I was still consulting with Athletics Canada and athletes throughout that whole time period. I think the first event I went to was the 2006 Melbourne Games, in fact. And then a job opened up in Victoria, British Columbia at one of our Canadian sport institutes, Canadian Sport Institute Pacific. And Hilary and I moved back to Canada, to Victoria, British Columbia in 2011. And we've been here in Victoria ever since. We have a couple of young boys now, 2 boys under the age of 5, and we own a house. So although I preach variability at some point, you got to lay down some roots. And so we're probably going to be in Victoria for at least a little time forward. That gives a little bit of background in trying to mix applied sports science with research, and it's certainly challenging at times, but when it's done right, it's for me one of the greatest satisfactions I can get.
So there's a couple of things in there to potentially unpack there. So obviously your wife, Hilary Stellingwerff, but Hilary Edmondson, was that right?
That was her maiden name.
Maiden name. I don't know how long she competed under that name. I'm not quite sure whether some of the middle distance athletes I was working with overlapped with Hilary, but that's probably where we met, actually, wasn't it? I think we met in Valencia at the World Indoors. Yeah. And it was I remember having a conversation with someone in the bar saying, "There's another sports scientist over there." I was like, "Really?" It was like some sort of curiosity. And I think you were coaching that. You were coaching Hilary then, were you?
So throughout Hilary's entire career, Dave Scott Thomas at Guelph and myself co-coached Hilary. Ultimately, the 3 of us talked very open, very clearly. The buck stopped with Dave.
Okay.
However, we lived in Switzerland and Dave was in Canada, or we lived in Victoria and Dave was across the country near Toronto in Guelph. And so ultimately, there were times of the year that I would write a lot of the program or adapt the program. And it was a real collaborative effort, but ultimately the responsibility, and I truly do believe that, it's rare that I've seen a co-coaching situation work. You can have assistant coaches, but I think there needs to be a sole person responsible for the program, and that was Dave. And that was very purposeful because Hilary and I are married. We want to continue to be married, and high performance is not easy at times. So I believe at that time in Valencia, in fact, I was because at the tail end of her career, I coached Joe Mersch or Joe Fenn.
Yeah. Oh,
And
that's right. Yeah.
yeah. So she would come over to Switzerland, live at our house for training stints, and I was coaching Joe. And because at the time her coach OC had, or no, AO, sorry,
Yeah.
had cancer, wasn't doing as well, and she was looking for a shift. And I mean, there's an example of an athlete who I could probably say was one of the most talented
Mm.
female middle distance runners I've ever worked with. But I think she'd had 6 compartment surgeries by the time I was working with her, and we just couldn't figure out a way to systematically and intelligently give her enough load on her legs to be able to get the training required to exploit that natural talent. But yeah, so that I think it was Joe that might have introduced us at that bar in Valencia. I can't remember, but maybe she was buzzing around there.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I remember Joe. I remember testing Joe back in the day, and she reminds me of an athlete that I wrote about in the book called Laura Finucane, who you probably wouldn't have heard of,
No.
but he's probably the most talented athlete I've ever worked with. But she was just the wrong side of the line. She
Yeah.
didn't even have the moments that Joe had in the indoors, where successful
Yeah.
indoor career.
Yeah.
We just couldn't keep her fit and
Yeah.
well, injury free. But
Yeah.
she had everything, absolutely
Yeah.
everything, and that's such a delicate line, isn't it? Most people will see the people who got there and perhaps didn't quite win, but the people who are just on the wrong side of the line. I think Usain Bolt is just on the right side of the line of that
Yeah.
sense of you don't see people have seen him turn up at the major competitions and perform, but what you haven't seen is his persistent injury problems that he's had to
Yeah.
battle with, probably from the limb length that makes him so brilliant.
Yeah. No. Yeah. If there's a theme that comes out of our talk today is I get as much personal relationships and satisfaction out of the successes as the athletes that are dedicated and come out slightly on the wrong side of the line. And in fact, you'd probably pull most athletes at the Olympics, and I'd say 70 to 80% aren't satisfied with their Olympic outcome. And that's the reality is, you have these Olympic dreams, and those dreams are really challenging to make a reality. And it all comes down to, if your whole self-worth is based on what your Olympic outcome is, you you better recheck and rethink, because you better enjoy the journey more than the outcome, because especially in a sport like athletics, where it's really competitive and it's really hard to showcase your skills, it can be a tough road. Yeah.
We're just hitting mines of interesting topics here now. So variability and breadth. I mean, can you ask you a little bit more about Hilary? How did you meet Hilary, and how did you manage that almost professional relationship whilst also having a personal relationship too?
Sure. Yeah. So Hilary and I grew up in this same small area of Canada, near London, Ontario. I'm from a town of 600, and she's from the big city of Sarnia, which had, I think, 50,000. And I had to drive an hour one way to go to the closest track club. And it was Sarnia Track and Field Club, and she was part of that track club. I'm 5 years older than Hilary. So in high school, she was, I don't know, some girl in the track club. And I went off to university. And then at the tail end of university, when she was coming through, she was much, much, much better than I was relatively at every stage of her career. Canadian junior champ, for example, and then went off to the University of Wisconsin on a track and field scholarship to work with Peter Teagan, who's was a long-time, really famous coach. And Jerry Schumacher was there at the time, who's now the Bowerman Track Club coach, who's arguably probably one of the best groups in the world right now for endurance running. And she had a wonderful career there. And so we started to date when she was in Wisconsin. I was at grad school then at Guelph, and would drive the 10 or 11 hour drive as much as I could back and forth. And yeah, it was a natural fit. Like, we're both into running and both independent, that we could do our own things. And by the time I was finishing up my PhD at Guelph 5 years later, we got married that summer. And about halfway through her Wisconsin career, she started to spend the summers at Guelph with me, and she got a job locally, and then she joined the track club in Guelph. And so that's when she met Dave Scott Thomas. And so coming out of her Wisconsin university, she shifted to being primarily coached by Dave and myself. And then her international career blossomed from there, and she made a couple of Olympic teams. When it came to our relationship, we were pretty clear and made really clear expectations around the situation of coaching. Ultimately, Dave was the primary coach. That was very purposeful. And I was an assistant coach in helping manage things if we were away, like we lived in Switzerland for a while or Victoria. And so, but it was certainly challenging at times I was primarily the one at almost all the training sessions, and to sometimes shut those off and come home and try to have a normal relationship. It still is. She's coaching now. She's retired. Her last race was in Rio. We have a couple of kids, and she coaches at the local university. And yeah, I would say, a lot of chatter over dinner and evenings is around training and coaching, but we're probably a little more liberal about that now, in fact, and because it's both of our jobs as well, and it's both of our passions. So why wouldn't we talk about that and chew it up and et cetera, et cetera. So but with any journey, there's ups and downs, and with any marriage, there's ups and downs, and it just takes constant work, constant communication. And I would be lying if I said there wasn't some bumps along the way, but we work through them.
And looking back in terms of managing that boundary, what your kind of key insights and reflections? I'm asking for a friend. Obviously, I work with my wife. I think it's a challenge for people, but also I think a lot of people with these kind of blended careers now, where you're never off, you're always on in some ways. You naturally take your work home with you, regardless of whether you're sharing that responsibility.
In the modern world, with being able to be clicked in and checked in, it is challenging at times in the world of, say, coaching or research, because you've just nailed it. You can choose to never be off ever. Like in research, you're going to be, if you retire at age 60, you're probably still going to write papers until you're 64 to get all the students through. Like you never have a to-do list that's clear. And so first you have to come to just grips with that. If you're someone who likes to check off your to-do list, just get rid of that mindset. I'm jealous sometimes of our, in some ways, like our massage therapists or chiros who have a set schedule, and they do their charting and they're done. And, but I also like the flexibility that this position offers. So my wife and I, we try to work really hard to have some common goals. So for example, when I come home from work and things are under control, I come in and I'm there with Hilary and the kids and the boys, helping with dinner and getting prepared and helping clean the table and getting baths done and getting the boys to bed. And I try not to check my phone or have my laptop on in that whole period. At 8:30, I might have a little check-in on work. But to be honest, I'm in bed most nights by 9:30 or 10, because the 1-year-old, the likelihood that he sleeps through the night is probably minimal. And the 4-year-old likes to get up at 6:30 in the morning. So there you are. I've had to shift things. So I do very little work in the evenings, other than maybe a quick check-in after the boys are in bed. And we try to structure it that way, because you're right. You can, if you want, work 24/7, and you're never going to be caught up. And so you need to get rid of that mindset.
Yeah. Okay. So that's interesting. But the potential difference there was that you might have had a responsibility attached to decisions. So you might be making a call. She might have a completely different opinion. And whilst it's not necessarily about the heating bills or the mortgage or some of these responsibilities, this is about the career decisions.
Yeah. So, I mean, there are times where my phone might vibrate and I know it's a pretty critical call and we're getting dinner ready, and I'll be like, Hilary, I'm going to have to take this one. And I will, because it's a critical call. But I would say that happens only once every couple of weeks or once a month. Or if people call me at dinner, I just don't answer. I just leave the phone over there. But it might work vice versa for Hilary too. like common sense needs to prevail, like I think there's a responsibility to your relationship with your partner. There's a responsibility that you have with your kids. There's a responsibility that you have with the athletes that you're working with and the coaches you're working with. The level of urgency and the definition of the level of urgency might be different across all those. And so that's where you need alignment in terms of what's actually urgent versus what can wait till tomorrow, and you can follow up then.
Yeah, very good. Okay, so back to this word of variability. That sounds interesting. So my sort of one reflection when people say, "What would you have done differently whilst you were studying?" My top tip is I would have read more broadly. I would have sought inspiration and inputs from a whole vast field, as opposed to what you're encouraged to do is go for more depth. That you find the topic that you're interested in, and then the subdomain, and then the key area, and then you go hard on that. So talk to me a little bit about what that variability has given you versus what has been a fairly not traditional, but a fairly linear route through postgrad, postdoc, and so on. What's that variability offered you?
You've mentioned depth and breadth, and I think managing those two things and thinking about those two things are important for everyone at different stages of their career. If you want expertise, you do need to go deep sometimes, and you need to bury yourself in a certain topic area and really become one of the experts around that topic area. So certainly I'm trying to hang on to dear life for some areas of sports nutrition and endurance physiology as an expertise area, and continue to read and actively read and research in those areas.
Hang on to dear life. That's an interesting phrase. Tell us what how that's unrolling for you.
Because I'm now in much more leadership roles where the breadth is important. So I'm also the sports science, sports medicine lead for all of Athletics Canada. So I have to know a little bit about a lot of things. I'm an expert generalist across a lot of things. The first one to raise my hand and say, I don't know that, but I can find the person that does know that is the expert for you in that area. And so with the explosion of journals and research, there's more than 400 papers a year in sports nutrition. I can't read 400 papers a year in sports nutrition. So plus I love endurance physiology and altitude physiology and environmental physiology. So by hanging on for dear life, it's actively reading and keeping up with the literature while having a couple of kids at home, while coaching a little bit, while trying to be in a leadership position at our institute and a leadership position with Athletics Canada. So it's certainly challenging, but certainly the concept of scaffolding in terms of learning comes into play when you've got 20, 30 years of depth in a research area. I can burn through a paper pretty quick and scaffold things onto my knowledge bank, probably at 3 or 4 times faster than I used to when I was 20 years old, and I would get that paper in front of me and it would take me 2 hours to get through it. Right. So, there's that balance of depth and breadth there.
That's interesting in the sense of you still are motivated to stay abreast of the knowledge area, almost maintaining the pool of knowledge, and as it grows, trying to understand and grasp the possibilities there, as opposed to what I think a lot of people will tend to do. I don't want to generalize too much, but I think this is a decent stereotype, is I have a need, I have been asked a question, or I sense there's an opportunity. I now then go and find that knowledge and then bring that knowledge back and bring it forward to somebody.
Yeah, I would say I try to do a bit of both. I'm very purposeful in where I want to go deep on and stay up to speed on. So sports nutrition, endurance physiology. So just when I say endurance physiology, that's primarily endurance periodization concepts and altitude environment. Those are my 3 buckets that I really try to actively stay up to speed on. It's really easy as a middle distance running primarily physiologist to start to get pulled into, say, biomechanical constraints of performance determinants. I'm aware of like Peter Weyand's work and certainly some of the concepts there, but if I start actively reading there, I'm going to have to give up something somewhere else. So instead, I'll do what you've just secondary mentioned. Oh, there's a need. I've tried to create probably 20 or 30, I don't call them a network. They're good friends. They're colleagues that I can reach out to and say, hey, what do you think of this? What do you think of that? Because it's slightly outside of those three buckets that I'm trying to be deep in. And so that you end up with a really good network, where I can just pick up the phone and I do try to do it initially by phone, not email, and just have a chat with someone around the world on a topic that's slightly outside of my area of expertise.
Yeah. Okay. So, sports nutrition background, but
Yes.
and clearly an exercise physiologist or an exercise physiology interest because of the training background that you've got, or coaching, and altitude. Is that? Can I interpret that as you're sensing that as an opportunity to enhance performance, and therefore you've gravitated some of your interest into that area?
Yeah, great question. So when we first moved to Switzerland, I don't know how many years ago that was, St. Moritz was basically in our backyard. It was a relatively short drive for a Canadian, 4 hours, and we're up at St. Moritz. And when we landed in Lausanne, the two-time world champ and now Olympic champ from the women's 1500, Mariam Jamal, lived a mile from us. And she's Ethiopian descent, but ran for Bahrain, but trained and worked with a Swiss coach, Jean-Francois Pahoud, who is a great older gentleman who is retired. He was the head of the IOC museum for a bunch of years and the assistant meet director for the local Athletisme Diamond League. And so they went and used altitude 2-3 times a year. And Jean-Francois had used altitude at that time. He was 65 years old. He'd used it for 20 or 30 years. And you get up to St. Moritz and there's no better place on earth to be inspired than that place, just from a training perspective. And I'm embedded with some of the best African runners in the world. Like we had Darutu Tulu join our training camps. Obviously Miriam was there. We had Jean-Francois to learn from, and he was a great teacher. And so at that time, I just got inspired by the environment, to be honest. It was less about the science. It was like, this is a really great place to train. I can see how this is performance enhancing regardless of the oxygen content. And the partial pressure of of the altitude.
Yeah, nice. Yeah, well, I edit that out.
Yeah, so it was just from there, and then things developed, and we've published a few papers now. We'll have 20 to 40 athletes show up every April here in Flagstaff, and 2 out of the last 4 years we've run a study up here, and then published it. We did an iron study that was just published in MSSE about 2 months ago. That was done 2 years ago, an iron altitude study, and an energy availability altitude study in 2016 with 51 athletes across 6 countries. So so I would say that I'm not overly published in altitude. I think maybe 5 or 6 papers, but it is a research area of passion for me.
Fascinating stuff. Certainly one of those areas that I look back on, and some of the discussions with Barry Fudge and Jamie Pringle probably over a decade now, 12 years ago. I was just thinking, you know what, if we're going to host the Olympics, what do we want to put our focus on? What do we want to go for? We really wanted to go for altitude and hypoxia and nail that, because it just exploit that opportunity rather than just go, some people respond, some people don't. Let's just leave it there. And actually work it out, problem solve it. Why do people respond? Why do other people have a bad response? Because that's clearly not good, but it's clearly provoked the physiology.
Yeah, I know you nailed it. And I have a review paper that I'm a co-author on in Review in Sports Medicine right now with Inigo Majuka and Avish Sharma. And it's periodization for elite athletes from macro, meso to micro in altitude. And we argue in there that if done properly, we're not sure there are non-responders.
Yeah.
You just have to be really careful and individualize your hypoxic response. And I don't know what you think, but my experience generally is if you have a sea-level hammerhead, the guy or the girl that just hammers everything, that's just pushing, they tend to be, regardless of all the lab tests you could do, if you just know those types of athletes, you better be bloody careful with them at altitude, because they're the types of ones that are going to be the non-responders, because they go over the cliff, they're going to get sick, they're going to overdo it, they're going to overcook it. So if you can find and you have a relationship with that type of athletes to hold their psyche back a little bit, then I don't know. My experience with altitude is that it can work for almost all athletes if you're able to individualize it appropriately.
Yeah, I tend to think so. It's a potent stimulus, isn't it? It's a bit like
Yeah.
threshold training. You've got to be careful with it. And that's a good way to overtrain. It's a good way to burn out. Therefore, it's potent. Therefore, if you use it artfully, you can get the curve going the right way.
Yeah, I agree.
And interestingly, just how potentially, I suppose this comes into in-depth chat now about gene signaling and so on. But interestingly, over 10 years, seeing that what used to work now doesn't work as well. You just have to keep dialing it up. But then that works for that. That applies to overload, doesn't it? Where it didn't it used to work. What got you to that particular point isn't your body's now got used to it and gone whatever, and you now need to up the dose.
Yeah, it's the sigmoidal curve of adaptation, and when you're working with the best DNA on the planet, you're way out on that very small incremental part of the curve, and you have to think creatively about creating stimuli that's going to push them up, but not push them over the edge, and that's quite challenging. The ironic bit with a lot of the literature is that it's average university trained males who are in the steep part of the sigmoidal curve, and so everything works. And so if you're reading the literature, just, and it's an average trained university male who doesn't have a menstrual cycle, obviously, just be aware, like they have a lot of headroom to move into, and therefore a lot of interventions are going to work. And some of the better done meta-analysis was split out trained versus sub-trained athletes. There's one on bicarb where the effect size in university males is 0.6 or 0.8, but the effect size in trained athletes is 0.2. It's 4 times lower, and that makes complete sense to me.
Is that right? I have to dig that out. I've got a general principle that I would use with middle distance athletes, where you might use bicarb for the first stage of their career to kind of get their kind of racing capabilities up, but actually the efficacy tends to wear off, or it just doesn't seem to help as much, certainly when they need a kick. Interesting stuff. And it's an interesting one in that it's really easy to pick up a study, and well, not really easy, it doesn't always fly, but if you pick up a study and say this generally works, power breathe device will work for rowers generally, but it's a harder sell to say, look, this is something that on average doesn't work for people, but we think it might work if we keep persisting at it, but we don't know yet. We've got to work it out for you. We've got to problem solve it for you.
Yeah, no, and that's the art of an intervention with an elite athlete is the published data on the super elites is going to be very small. You try to extend from the sub elites or recreationally trained data. You look at the risk and reward. You look at it in combination with what else is going on in terms of their training program and their individualized history, and you try to make the best informed decision you can in an open and transparent way with the coach being informed. And if they're a senior level-headed athlete, I love them at the table. I want them fully informed as well. And that's kind of how I approach interventions.
All right, that's interesting. I'm gonna fly with a different type of question now. Completely unfair, hard, tough, big hitting question. Are there any key concepts that you often refer to, key principles that you'll say, yeah, that's a habit, that's a thing that happens, but we haven't observed it in the literature. It hasn't necessarily been captured in in a journal article. You know, that concept where coaching is ahead of science and science is kind of keeping up. Any other key principles that you would refer to, but you know it, but it's not been written?
Yeah, so I think the term for that is tacit knowledge. Some people use the term anecdotal knowledge, but tacit knowledge is something where you know it, but it hasn't been written. And I think any coach that's been in this game for more than 20 years oozes tacit knowledge, whether they realize it or not. You know, we were talking about like a Mark Rowlands at the onset here. And again, for young practitioners, just really good coaches can run experiments way quicker than we can. They just might not have the structure around it to get the cleanest outcome or answers. And that's where you can come in and work with that coach to say, okay, what are your key principles to show that something works? Don't impose your principles on the coach. Find out from the coach what are the principles, what are the metrics that they decide. How do they write their training program on the weekend? What metrics did they use to say this athlete's going to do this next week? And start your conversation there with them. And then you can build out and figure out ways to better measure what's going on. And I think the tacit knowledge from coaches is very underappreciated. But you can see concepts and principles that start to inform other decisions. And so, you know, a classic example of that is, say, Stephen Seiler's work in Norway, where he came over from, I think, a postdoc from Texas, and he started to observe what a lot of the Norwegian cross-country skiers were doing. They weren't necessarily, from a mechanistic perspective, sure why it worked, but you know, the concept of polarized training in their field was something that Stephen first, you know, started to describe and then measure, and now there's intervention studies, and you know, if memory serves me correct, that was probably one of the big interventions you had with Mike East in terms of slowing down some of his off day runs to allow him to bang harder and get more specificity on his track sessions. So there's an example of something where there was tacit coaching knowledge. You then got a physiologist involved who first descriptively identified it, and you know, and now it's moved on, and there's intervention studies to show that you know, I don't believe in polarization for absolutely everyone. Marathoners live in that middle zone. they need specificity that's not always on the high end, but as a principle, I do generally agree with it. So I don't know if that answers your question in a roundabout way. Of
Yeah, it does. I mean, one of the key ideas that I often look for when working with athletes is one of the common mistakes, certainly in track and field or running per se, or triathlon, is that those easy sessions turn into hard sessions. It says 30-minute easy run, so someone goes out for a 30-minute time trial instead. So all the training doesn't necessarily get polarized, it gets concertinaed. So that's where perhaps running is because you can limit you have to limit your amount of training because of the forces you experience. You haven't got the same training volumes as a swimmer or a cyclist. So you make it tougher on your physiology, and that might work if you're part-time, but it doesn't work if you're full-time and you have freedom to distribute your training, which I think is probably, I find that a better term, distributing your training, variability, a bit of variety in what you're doing, challenging the body.
Yeah, I agree. You hit a few things there that are really important. That the neuromuscular load that runners face is significantly greater than swimmers, rowers, cyclists, and so your top marathoners are only physically able to run 10 or 12 hours a week, maybe a bit more for some, but I mean, that's 1/3 of the amount of world-class swimmers or triathletes or rowers who can go 25 and 30 or north of 30 hours a week, and it's just neuromuscular pounding and load. And you know, if you do some quick maths, it's, you know, if you're a female and you run 100K a week, you're at about 90,000 steps a week. You multiply that by body weight, you multiply that by about 2.8 kilograms per force step, and you're well over 20 million kilograms of load like that. And when you do the same mass on rowing, it actually adds up really nicely. Oh, okay, that's why they can do a 30-hour week. So there's that element. I think the variability of training is incredibly important as a principle. Sometimes I think we overthink it, and systematic overload that allows physiological adaptation, but also psychological and emotional achievement, so they can see the journey. That's probably as important as some of the physiology of really designing nice programs from week to week. You want to stretch them, but not so far that that they have a failure in a workout or a complete failure in a workout. But conversely, you may push them to failure now and again in a workout. But yeah, so I think there's a lot of concepts you've laid down there that really good coaches, again, they just tacitly know how to do that, and they've experienced that over 20, 30, 40 years of coaching.
Yeah. When I talk to the guys that work in football, they'll say, I'm not necessarily designing this training program for a physical effect. I just need to keep them engaged. In the middle of the season, when they're tired and they're fractious and competition's starting to hot up, contract negotiations are starting to happen, they just need to keep them engaged and making it fun or making it interesting, so that they're at least mindful and present in the session, as opposed to it's the same as last week so we can measure it.
Yeah, no, it's spot on, and probably some of us have lost our way a little bit on that with too many metrics and too many measurements and too many outcomes, and sometimes maybe we just have to ask the athletes, on a scale of 1 to 10, was that fun? And I don't see that on many reporting scales, and it probably should be on there, because I don't know, athletes that are happy and healthy are ones that and consistent are the ones that perform the best. It's that simple.
Great insight. So sports nutrition, that's kind of your field, but with some other branches and so on. Give us a little bit of a state of the nation. Where is it at in terms of its growth? It's been quite rapid over the last few decades, and certainly the interest has grown as much as anything. I think because everyone eats, so they've got an opinion about it. It's a bit like pop psychology, that suddenly sleep science is popular because, oh yeah, I know everything about sleep because I do it every day or night. So tell us, where is it at the moment? What's the latest kind of insights and thoughts that you've got there?
Yeah, you've stolen some of my words. I love sports nutrition because I think in one sense it can be incredibly impactful over time for an athlete to and for life skills, just to wade through that and start to nail those elements. But it's probably one of the more frustrating fields to work in as well, for exactly what you just said. Everyone will eat 3 to 6 times a day, and so everyone's very experienced at eating, but just because you're experienced at something doesn't necessarily make someone an expert in something. And I joke around. I fly a lot. I'm very experienced at flying, but you don't want me at the front of the plane when it's time to land. And so, yeah, that's part of why nutrition is great, because it's an absolute requirement. But at the same time, it's frustrating because everyone can have an opinion, and I'm okay with that. They should have an opinion. Where nutrition is also, the way I look at it is it's one of the sports science interventions that has the absolute lowest barrier to entry. And by that, what I mean is, if you just eat 4 or 5 times a day, and it's foods that your great grandmother would recognize, and you eat in close proximity to after training, and you're rarely hungry, you're 95% there. The barrier to entry is incredibly low. It doesn't, for a lot of athletes, if we can just get them there, that's fine. That's great success for them on sports nutrition, and they can work their way around the kitchen and make lots of different options for meals, and that's it. However, if I took an athlete and told them not to eat for 3 days, they would very quickly see the impact of nutrition on their performance. So the barrier to entry is really low, but the impact can also be really high if you I would never tell an athlete not to eat for 3 days, but I'll say that to them just to make a provocative statement about the impact that nutrition can have. So most athletes will train 300 to 600 times a year. Most of them will eat 1,400 to 1,600 times a year. And so nutrition tends not to be a eureka moment, unless maybe it's a marathoner and last week they did 30 or 35 kilometer progression run on water, and this week they did it on say, a carb drink. Then they might have a eureka moment, like, whoa, I felt really good off the back end of that. But generally, it's a slow drip. It's Chinese water torture. It's just slow and steady. You're not going to light it up tomorrow just because you ate really healthy last night, but it's just something that over time might slowly decrease illness rates, allow for consistency, decrease injury rates, et cetera, et cetera. So the other thing with nutrition that's incredibly frustrating, and it's kind of the white elephant in the corner for a lot of folks, is measuring energy intake is about as accurate as trying to measure rain in a hurricane. It's a mess. And anyone that says they can do it is on an individual level is disillusioned. It is really challenging to accurately measure food intake, let alone micronutrient intake and everything else that follows. It's also really, really challenging to accurately measure energy expenditure, unless you're using double labeled water or you're in a metabolic chamber. But even then, there's noise. And so one of the areas that I think that is emerging and continuing to emerge that's relatively new is REDS, relative energy deficiency in sport. Again, I think it's another white elephant in the corner with a lot of systemic issues. And the frustrating thing with REDS is that if you have a large group population, you can get at measure energy intake a little bit more accurately because you have a large group. But we know that as little as 300 calories a day can make a significant outcome in REDS. And 300 calories you can't measure that on the individual level. And 300 calories on any single day is just fine if you're out. However, 300 calories out for the year, that's the month of March with no eating. That's 110,000 calories. So if you told an athlete, like, just don't eat for the month of March, well, that's what 300 calories is spread across the year. And so very subtle deficits in energy intake have profound outcomes on bone health, immune function, performance, adaptation. And so the frustrating bit is we know on the group level that 300 calories count, but on the individual level, it's really challenging to measure that. And so we use secondary indicators like stress fracture history, sex hormone levels, like menstrual cycle status in females or testosterone in males, sex drive in males, injury illness status. We use a bunch of secondary, more chronic measurements of energy availability to say, yeah, you're at high risk here, and there may be an issue. And so I'm biased. I've done a fair amount of research in this area, but I also think that, especially in the endurance world, there's a lot of issues around gut health that I think are linked to energy availability, issues around depression that I think could be linked back to energy availability. And there's a lot of links that need a lot more science to be causation rather than correlation. So there's still a lot of work to be done. I don't want to overspeak the impact of it, but I do think it's an important field that has exploded in the last 5 years or so. Sorry, that was a long answer.
That's amazing. That's amazing. Yeah, I'm still thinking about what your grandma was eating. Okay, so let's unpack a bit of that. So you've got this key concept that of energy in, energy out, and if you could get an accurate handle on that, then there would be an enormous potential to protect athletes, but also get them into the positive adaptive state. So that's a real tightrope, but you're almost doing it blindfold. So you're looking for those checks and balances of feeling the secondary responses, and presumably, staying on the right side of the line means that you might put on more body fat, for example, which has negative effects on performance. So you're trying to feel your way along without actually knowing whether you're right or not. On top of which, you've got variability in training load, you've got periodized plans, you've got changes in the season, you've got blocks of work, you've got competition, as well as getting older. So a lot of moving parts there, like tectonic plates, to try and help an athlete. How do you navigate that?
Yeah, you've nailed the complexity there, and I think ultimately it's sitting down with the athlete and coach and using words that and concepts they understand. Um, it's so rare I'll have an athlete do a 3-day or 4-day dietary food record, partly because it's almost impossible to measure accurately, and two, I don't want them to get over obsessed with calorie counting. I think that's dangerous. Um, we'll talk about what their plates look like and how the plate might need to look different after a long session versus an easy run. We'll talk about sometimes we'll have them record a day just to look at the temporal structure of their eating in relationship to their training. But it's not to quantify in terms of caloric counts or anything like that. It's really challenging, and there's a hierarchy of risk that I have in my head that's not published yet. Like if you look at the Reds consensus statement, there's different points, like 3 points for this or 2 points for that. Like if you've had more than 3 stress fractures, it's a slightly higher risk, but the points are actually right now allocated out actually pretty evenly. And I think that there's different hierarchy of risks. For example, if you're an amenorrheic female who's had more than 4 stress fractures, those indicators are way more important than a recent change in body weight, which could be influenced by 1,000 other things. And so, at least in my head, I try to look at risk factors and try to have those conversations, which they can understand. They understand when they get a stress fracture or when they're amenorrheic. The other thing that you mentioned is that, in fact, contrary to what people understand or a lot of people understand or believe, the longer that you're in energy balance, very close to balance, energy out, energy in, the leaner athletes get over their career. And there's both published papers on that, and I have a whole bunch of longitudinal unpublished data on eumenorrheic versus amenorrheic females. And it's the leanest females I've ever worked with are the ones with normal menstrual cycles who got pregnant like this. And it's something where they just get leaner and leaner and leaner, and they're in really good energy balance. They aren't over, they aren't under. The other thing to think about at times, especially on the male side of things, is if you're in slight deficit and you have low testosterone, by eating more, you actually lean out because you increase the testosterone back up. And I know it's counterintuitive, but we've seen that repeatedly in a lot of males. Yeah. And I'll sit with them and say, like, listen, testosterone's on the banned substance list for a reason. The 2 best ways we can recover your testosterone are adjusting training load, which you don't want to do. And I don't want you to have to do that because you got to train a lot to be a world-class endurance athlete, or we can replace the energy balance. So let's start, just come with me on a journey. Let's start with just 300 calories a day and let's see how that does for 2 or 3 months. And some of them will be a little bit, I'm going to gain weight. I'm like, let's just see what happens.
Yeah. And, test it. Test and learn.
And a lot of times, 3 months later, they're the same weight but leaner, and they've been healthier and not had the reoccurring bone injuries. And so sometimes the intervention is just 200 or 300 calories, and so then I'll show them pictures of what that looks like. And for a lot of them in the day, that's actually a pretty easy ask. They just have to be conscious to push that extra 200 or 300 calories in every day. So it's complex, but I think. I can't remember if we're recording or not. I love the complex cases. I find them fun. They can be frustrating, but maybe that's part of the reason I like working in this space of REDS as well. Yeah.
Okay. So, I like that because it's what you're looking for there is positive learning and trialing. You don't necessarily know whether it's going to work, but let's find out. Let's find out if you're going to be in a better place as a consequence of this very small, low-risk intervention that could be highly preventative. You also tapped on one interesting concept there where you were saying, I don't necessarily want to be the person or the cause of obsessive behaviors or getting into calorie counting. So if you're asking them to record food diaries or taking pictures of their meals a lot, you're talking there about those craft skills of knowing if I could be responsible potentially of sending that someone down a downward spiral by my thirst for understanding about their energy intake, for example. Um, and and a lot of nutrition is emotional. It's behavioral in that sense. How much you're thinking about the knowledge and the literature and thinking about the testosterone responses or sex hormone responses, but you're also got to be thinking about how do I communicate this to that other person who's different from me, thinks differently from me, but food is a weighted subject.
It is, and you approach it with a lot of respect and humility that way. And living in Europe, you very immediately see that one of the defining features of every single country and culture is food. It's very different in Netherlands and Switzerland and Italy. And in North America, it's a little more of a little more mixed, right? It's a melting pot of foods here. But in Europe, there's a real cultural identity to what you eat, how you sit with your family and eat. And it's sacred to people, and that's what's awesome about food. But it's also, you have to come at the table with an athlete and respect that, understand their background, understand their journey, and so it's probably the most nuanced sports science out there, because we could probably brainstorm 50 plus influencers of food intake, and probably 40 of them are emotionally linked. There's studies on if you're out to eat, whatever the first person orders actually influences a fair amount what subsequent orders tend to be.
Right. Okay.
Like the size, volumetrics. There's a bunch of research on the size of your plate and how the food looks on that plate. Like, I mean, it's, you eat, food intake changes if you used a cold tub versus a hot tub. The hunger signals.
Okay. Similar to the research around swimmers having
Correct.
the post
Yeah.
swim munchies.
Yeah. There's one paper. There's only one bloody paper, Stubbs et al., because I've referenced it about 5 times in my career, that's looked at the change of self-selected energy intake with a taper. Like we need to do a better job there. So any young practitioners out there looking for a project, look at self-selected food intake during taper when energy expenditure is coming down. I'm unaware of self-selected food intake versus intervention with an injury where energy expenditure almost goes to zero in athletes. Like, there's just so much work that we need to do to better understand those relationships. And
potentially with injury, you've got a confounding factor of feeling down, depressed, potentially, in the sense of, when after a big competition or the high, you get the low, and you get people overeating or depressed. I'm gonna take this out on the biscuits.
Yeah. I eat because I'm sad, and I'm sad because I eat. It's like this bad spiral. And so, there's a concept or a term called orthorexia nervosa. And orthorexia nervosa is an over obsession with clean eating and food. And I've seen that coming up more and more and more with our athletes who we want to be disciplined, who we want to be really cooperative. I don't like to use the word compliance, but cooperative. We want those traits in our athletes, but they can also come too much and on a downward spiral. And so for orthorexia nervosa, I'm like, can you have the apple pie at grandma's house at Christmas? And if your answer is no, we got to unpack this, because that's insane. Every athlete on the planet should be able to have apple pie at Christmas at grandma's house. You're not going to eat the whole pie every single night, but if you can enjoy Christmas with your family and have a little bit of a food indulgence, well, that's a big red flag for me. So it's working on those elements. And again, I really enjoy those conversations with athletes, and I'll try to adjust my style to their background and to their needs and to their culture, and develop those trusting relationships and work from there.
Yeah, that's a fascinating area. Just that emotional aspect of food. Where do you kind of sit? I might know the answer to this question, but in terms of the use of fads, to illustrate, gain attention, gain traction, use those as hooks for getting buy-in from an athlete. There's a lot of fads in dietetics and nutrition. It seems like if somebody's a vegan and they've won something, then suddenly there's a spike in Google searches for vegan diets. What's your thoughts?
With any new emerging outcome, it's very difficult initially to know if it's a fad or if it is actually going to develop into a scientific validated concept. And being an early adopter of anything new in sports science has a risk that you're going to jump onto a fad, which you don't want to, versus, oh, I was an early adopter of X, Y, or Z. So for example, I'll use an actual example. I started to use beta alanine with some of our middle distance athletes already in 2006. So that's quite early. Now, the papers published came through Professor Roger Harris, who also had success with creatine. Roger, for part of his career, worked at the Karolinska Institute, where they hand out the Nobel Prize. His reputation as a researcher is pretty solid. I emailed and actually called Roger to talk about this new beta alanine and carnosine and whether there's risks. Interestingly enough, in that phone call, he said, the transporter for beta alanine also uses taurine. I suspect taurine in the muscle might drop a little. He later proved that. But he's like, taurine's in such abundance, I don't think it's going to be an issue. So I did a lot of due diligence very early on to say, yeah, you know what? This is something I think we can get a safe source. It's tested. Let's give this a go. And and the data is now developed and been pretty positive, and there's meta-analysis, and it's now in the IOC consensus statement. Other fads, someone like Louise Burke has worked her entire career to try to show that fat might improve endurance performance. 10-15 years ago, as part of my PhD, we measured muscle biopsies to show fat adaptation actually inhibited PDH, which is an enzyme in glycolysis and an important enzyme for high performance intensity. And she would be the first to say, and I would as well, if there was a dietary intervention like keto that worked, we'd be all over it, because it's almost a net zero game in cost for the athlete. They just got to shift their macronutrients. I'm not discriminant on performance outcomes. I'll take any performance outcomes within the rules of sport that I'm able to easily deliver at a low cost. Like that's low hanging fruit. But again, the data has not supported that very well for high intensity athletes. And so, and then the final bit is with any fad, companies will absolutely exploit it and jump on it and try to create products, usually more expensive products, and create narrative around such fads that is really confusing for the consumer. And so, yeah, I don't know. It's hard to know what's going to initially sometimes be a fad versus something that'll actually come out and be scientifically proven. And a bunch of us jumped on really quickly on the beetroot stuff, and now the data, if you're north of a VO2 max of 65, it doesn't seem to work. Maybe the data is a bit stronger in elite rowers, but there's it doesn't seem to hurt. But there's something a bunch of us probably jumped on pretty quickly. But on the other hand, like, it's a fruit and vegetable. Like, you're not doing any harm by increasing beets in our athletes' diets. So yeah.
Okay, so an example like beta alanine early in its course, that it was a bit funky, it was a bit out there, unproven. We needed to know more, so it's potentially high risk, but a moderate return. Whereas beetroot, okay, well, perhaps some dietary, gut responses, should we call it? Then you've got this fairly low risk, but potentially moderate return. I've tended over the years to be a bit of a laggard on some of these. I'll just wait and see. And I think mainly I've taken that stance because if I just keep proposing new ideas all the time and then going, no, actually they don't really work, I lose reputation.
Correct.
You've got to be considered in your thought. And certainly when the ketone drink came out pre-London 2012, and it was all this secret thing, and it was going around the British system, and I got coaches in my ears saying, "Why haven't you told us about this?" And I'm like, "I've no thought that this is going to help you at all. Could it do any harm? Probably not, but it's another thing that would just get annoying, that I'm just trying to add more new ideas without necessarily the evidence that this is a high priority in that sense."
Yeah. One of the biggest mistakes I've made in my career was as a young practitioner, where I was really excited about 1,000 interventions. And I knew about all these interventions. And I had a younger coach who was also just really excited about interventions. And we just threw the kitchen sink at this group of athletes. And I learned a lot from that. I would give the athletes and the coach and myself maybe a C+ or a B- at those Olympics. But I tell you, it was impossible to disentangle because we just did way too much with them way too quickly. There's just way too many interventions from altitude to different supplements to a different type of training. And now I'm much more measured. I try to come at the level of the coach in terms of what their background is in terms of willingness of interventions. Let's think about it over an entire 4-year quad. What and where and when does it make sense to trial something where we can then put some extra measurement around it to see if we've moved the needle in the right way or not? Because you can brainstorm 50 interventions, but you can't effectively deliver more than a handful, I think. Yeah. I don't know if you've had similar experiences, but yeah, it's easy to get down the intervention rabbit hole and overdo it.
I mean, I've probably taken different tack over time. Is that sometimes when you have momentum around something, then you can do a bit of a yes and. So when we did some of the priming warm up work,
Yep.
that was really helpful for the psychologist, for the nutritionist, for the particular coach, because actually that's quite a sensitive period of time just before you perform.
Yeah.
So rocking up and throwing a load of stuff at it creates noise for the athlete.
Yeah.
And then I think the priming warm up was the one where the athlete went, "Great, I love this. This is a new plan. I'm going to use this. This is effective for me." To which then the psychologist said, "Well, if you're going to do that, then it might be worth you practicing that in training." So they were hooks that people could build upon, a bit like bicarb. Well, if you're going to do bicarbonate soda, then you need to be hydrated, or you need to make sure you're ingesting the right nutrients at the time. So you could build on top of it.
Hey, listen, your warm up paper, we use it all the time here. It's it's part of our protocol that we go through within the spring, and we'll test it in training. We'll even mimic the call room wait periods at certain times with athletes because of the 20 to 30 minute wait room that you'll have. We'll put measurements around it. We'll take some lactates. Did you overcook it? Did you undercook it? Did you have a long enough time for the lactate to come back down before? So that piece of work is something that is great. And your comment about tacking on the other elements is spot on. It's great that way.
Well,
so thanks for your contributions.
Yeah, thanks. That's all I'm going to include in the podcast. Just that bit. That's all I'm going to say. I'm going to say hi Trent, and you say that, and then I'm just going to go, "Thanks for joining me."
But that's the sweet spot, right? Like when you hear someone has actually taken science you've published and applied it somewhere else. Well, first of all, like I'm happy if more than 5 people have read my papers because it's science. And secondly, when you hear like, "Oh wow, someone else is actually," because it's so applied and practical, that someone can actually do that, and they're using my work. It was not my work. It's always a group effort. Our work, man, that really makes me smile.
Well, I'll tell you a funny story about that, and maybe offline I'll tell you another time about how we individualize from it. But I think we presented it at ACSM. Oh God, I'm going back now. It was a while ago, 2010 maybe. Anyway, David Pine stood around the poster, and he said, "What's going on, mate? Why are you presenting all this performance gain? I thought you Brits wanted to keep all the secrets to yourself." And I said, "Yeah, okay, well, there's maybe a second, possibly a 2-second improvement in performance there you can get. And we think this comes from your VO2 kinetics, preserving anaerobic
Yeah.
capacity, all comes in the back end of the race. You try and get a coach to take this on. Best of luck." Because this is risky. This is something that they want to protect. I said, this has taken me 15 years to get this idea in. I did my PhD in VO2 kinetics back in the late 90s.
Yeah.
And I said, we've just spent ages trying to get this idea across the line. Now we potentially got some evidence behind it that's got a bit of momentum, but it's still difficult to have that conversation. And I hooked up with David maybe 5 or 6 years later. And I said, any joy getting that idea over the line? He said, no. It's because it's tricky, isn't it, in that sense?
Yeah. I've with interventions like that, I say, yeah, it is risky before the Olympic final, the first time you do it. But let's try it in November before a workout. Okay, was that okay? Okay, now we'll try it again in December, and then we'll do it a bunch of times in the spring. And if at any point you want to pull a chute on it, and we'll put some measurements around it, we'll pull a chute. With that approach, it's worked pretty well.
Yeah, I think first time we used it with an athlete, we did that study in 2007. First time we used it was in 2008 with one athlete, and then systematically rolled it out for London.
Yeah, cool.
So, okay, I'm conscious of time actually, Trent. I could talk for hours. This is a tricky one. I know you won't appreciate this. Are you a scientist or a practitioner?
I'm a practitioner who uses science as a tool to better measure what I'm doing. I would say that. And the intersection of those two things are really challenging, because being a practitioner is a full-time job and being a scientist is a full-time job. And so what I try to, when I'm doing various leadership bits that are Canadian Sport Institute Pacific or talking to young practitioners, is I try to encourage it in my own work as a practitioner to do it such a standard that it's research grade. We're not going to have time to publish all this stuff or do case studies, and nor do we want to in some instances in terms of some competitive know-how, but our work will be, and we'll aspire it to be, research grade. And so I've had a lot of case studies published over my career. Case studies they're not going to prove anything, but they're incredibly important for a glimpse into the elite process. They're descriptive in nature. They're correlative in nature. They're not causative. I get all that, but I still think they have a place in the literature. And so I would say I'm a practitioner who uses science as a tool to create evidence for the interventions that I'm pursuing.
I love that. That's a great answer, and I wish perhaps I could flip that on its head and hope for more researchers and scientists to aspire to the same in the opposite direction of making their research applied, impactful, and accessible and translatable to the everyday person, whether that's an elite athlete or whether that's just the end user. Who's this for?
It is, but I would encourage scientists as well to take a high degree, an incredible degree of quality control in terms of some of their applied and practical measures. So by that, what I mean is, when you walk around ACSM and there's now 2 or 3 days of ergogenic aid posters, any Yahoo with a bike and a stopwatch can do performance measures. The barrier to entry to performance measures is as low as it gets. There's only 5 labs in the world that do muscle protein synthesis with phenylalanine tracers or deuterated tracers, because it's so technically difficult and expensive. And so the quality control of ergogenic aid and performance posters I see at major competitions tends to be the worst. There's some dubious and some really poorly done work. And so, just spending hours and days and weeks to set up a really good performance time trial with minimal noise and circadian rhythms and standardization and no feedback. Like that takes a lot of work and expertise to do really, really well. I'm proud that our lab does that well, but we're really anal on it. So yes, I would encourage academics and others to do more applied research, but appreciate that the noise and variability in measuring performance is as challenging as muscle protein synthesis FSRs, I think. So.
Fantastic. So, listen, what's the next kind of level for you? What's the next phase of work and ambition on a personal level and professional level for you?
It's a great question. I think sometimes our applied institutes have our heads in the sand a little bit around what I'll call practitioner life cycles. So, you can go to Harvard Business Review and read up on business the life cycles, and there's like 4 phases of a business life cycle, and they're usually somewhere in 10 or 20 year chunks of business life cycles. And I think practitioner life cycles are more around 4 to 6 year chunks. A lot of really good practitioners, once they get into a new situation, a new sport, or a new coach, and all of us, the good ones, we all want to be innovative, and we are innovative for 4, 5, 6 years. And then at some point within that context of that sport or that with that coach, you start to feel a little less innovative, and it's a little more routine. And, I think people start to then look for an exit plan. Like, okay, what can I do now to reinvent myself or re-innovate myself? And so certainly at our institute, we've started to look a little more carefully at, okay, this practitioner has been with swimming for 8 years. Let's have a heart-to-heart with them. And like, how are you doing? Do you need to maybe move sports? Do we need to think about a different career plan for you? Because we expect that if you're good, you're going to be looking for a new challenge. So, I'm in that 4 to 5 year period now with athletics, and we've moved back to Victoria in 2011. I'm always open to new things, but I'm also really satisfied in the groove that I'm in right now. We own a house. We got 2 young boys. My wife's now coaching track at the local university. There's huge synergies there. I'm up at Flagstaff. My family was just up here and joined us for a while. Yes, I go off to work during the day, but I have dinners with them. I can tuck the boys in at night. So right now, I don't have anything radical on the horizon other than continue to do research, continue to work mainly with athletics. I work a little bit with paratriathlon and mountain bike as well in Canada as kind of a senior physiology advisor. And maybe find ways to better manage my timetable. I would like to find ways to travel a little less with the boys at home now. But I think those are all doable in the foreseeable future. So I have no radical mic drops here on anything new coming from me. But at the same time, appreciate that there's a life cycle to practitioners. And I mean, you went through it yourself with your new business and transitioning away and being independent. And I'm sure that there's the highs are high and then the lows are low too, in terms of just I could imagine trying to be independent, and there's a lot of risk you take on yourself doing that. So, we'll see where my journey takes me. I'm not sure yet.
Fantastic. Some great aspirations. Not almost I'm hearing there reflecting on your own journey and the challenges, but also the pressures that you're under and the natural time aspects of that, but also thinking about that with a motivation of supporting other people through a healthier career themselves than perhaps you had or people before you.
Yeah, I don't watch TV. I don't watch Netflix. I actually enjoy on a Friday night working on a paper, analyzing data. I know that sounds crazy, but it doesn't fatigue me. It's a passion of mine. And Hilary, she'll be watching some Netflix or whatever on Friday night, and I'll be in the room, but I might be working on a data set or something. And I've realized, however, I'm much more conscious about when I might flick out an email, and I try to temper it on the weekends and in the evenings because we have really great staff whose passions might be in different spots. And I don't want them to think they need to be 24/7 staff. That's unhealthy. It's non-sustainable. part about being a sport practitioner 24/7 is self-care for at least 8 or 10 hours of that 24/7 a day. And it's exercising. I still try to get out 4 or 5 days a week for a run or for a mountain bike. It's good sleep patterns. I aspire to that too, as well as you can with 2 boys under 5. So yeah, it's finding that rhythm. I think young in your career, I encourage people to burn pretty hard. Maybe pre-kids and just go for it. But then at a certain point, you also have to find a rhythm that's sustainable for you. And I think periodize your work efforts. There's times where things are going to be pretty full on, and then there's times where I'll pull back significantly. And so for the next 2 weeks at this training camp, the family's back home. Well, I'm going to burn really hard this 2 weeks to just get a bunch of stuff done so that when I get home, I can pull back a lot, and the students' papers will all be up to speed, and all the projects are on top of it. And I can take a few loo days from work and spend some time at home with the kids.
Sounds good. Sounds like you're going to be typing at altitude. There's another study.
Most papers are written on the road at training camps, to be honest. Yeah.
Yeah, it's like that how productive you can get when you're on a plane when they've got no Wi-Fi. Although they're starting to introduce it. That's really annoying, isn't it?
Yeah.
Trent, I loved chatting to you. Loved your insights. I mean, we've covered everything there, haven't we? We've covered variability and finding balance, working with people, knowing stuff and doing stuff, coaching, tacit knowledge. But I've been hungry for Grandma's apple pie throughout. So that's been brilliant. I love the wisdom, but also the practicality that you're bringing to your work and that you're championing for other people. So thank you so much, Trent. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me on, Steve. The conversation was great.